The
We've got
flashing
to
blue
take
lights
this
of a police
seriously.
cruiser
We need
reflected
to
against the
focus
window
on
of the
what
most
really
expensive
matters in our
restaurant in
communities
Manhattan.
and build
I
a
sat in
better
the back of
future
that cruiser
together.
with cold steel handcuffs biting into my wrists while the woman I had loved for 20 years toasted with the man who had just framed me. They thought $50,000 was the price of my dignity. They thought stripping me of my freedom would silence me. They were wrong. Before I tell you how I lost my marriage, my freedom, and my reputation in a single night, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the one person you would have sacrificed everything to protect. My name is Luther. I am 55 years old and my hands are permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 engines. I own a small auto repair shop in Queens. It is not much, but it put food on the table and clothes on my wife's back for 2 decades, or at least I thought it did. Tonight was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. Vanessa had insisted on Le Bernardin. It was a place where a single appetizer cost more than a brake pad replacement. I felt like an intruder the moment I walked through the heavy glass doors. The air smelled of expensive wine and old money. I wore my charcoal gray suit. It was 5 years old, but I had it dry cleaned just for tonight. I sat at a corner table waiting for my wife, but Vanessa did not come alone. She walked in with Winston. I knew Winston. Everyone knew Winston. He was the real estate developer who had been buying up our neighborhood block by block. He was a man who wore suits that cost more than my entire shop. He guided Vanessa by the elbow with a possessiveness that made my stomach turn. Vanessa would not meet my eyes. She wore the diamond necklace I had bought her after saving for 3 years. It looked small and dull next to the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist that I had never seen before. They sat down across from me without a word. The silence at the table was heavier than the humid New York air outside. No one picked up a menu. No one ordered a drink. The waiter sensed the violence in the air and stayed away. Winston looked at me with a smile that did not reach his dead-cold eyes. He reached into his Italian silk jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He did not hand it to me like a man. He placed it on the ebony table and slid it across the surface with a flick of his manicured finger. The sound of the heavy paper hissing against the wood was the only sound in the universe. It stopped inches from my hand. I looked at the envelope, then at Vanessa. She was staring at the pristine white tablecloth as if it held the secrets to her salvation. She was trembling. "Open it," Winston said. His voice was smooth and cultured, the voice of a man who had never had to shout to be heard. I did not move. I asked Vanessa what was going on. I asked her why this man was at our anniversary dinner. Winston answered for her. He told me that I should listen to my betters. He leaned forward and wrinkled his nose. He said that even through the expensive dry cleaning of my cheap suit, he could still smell the motor oil on me. He said I smelled like poverty and bad decisions. He said I smelled like an anchor that was dragging Vanessa down to the bottom of the ocean. I looked at my hands. The grease was scrubbed out, but the calluses remained. These were the hands that had fixed heating systems in the dead of winter so Vanessa would not be cold. These were the hands that had held her when her mother died. Now Winston spoke of them as if they were a disease. I reached for the envelope. The wax seal broke with a sharp crack. I pulled out the documents. They were legal papers. A petition for the dissolution of marriage. And clipped to the front of the heavy bond paper was a check. It was a cashier's check made out to Luther King. The amount was $50,000. I stared at the numbers. $50,000. It was a lot of money. It could buy a new lift for my shop. It could pay off the mortgage on the house. But in this context, it was not money. It was a price tag. I looked up at Winston. He was watching me with the look a scientist gives a lab rat. He told me that this was a settlement. He said it was a generous offer for a man of my station. He said I just had to sign the papers, take the money, and disappear from Vanessa's life. He said Vanessa deserved a life of luxury, not a life of worrying about bills and smelling engine grease. I looked at Vanessa again. I needed her to look at me. I needed her to tell me this was a mistake. I needed her to tell me that she remembered the vows we made when we had nothing but a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment. She finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but they were hard. She did not look at me with love. She looked at me with pity. She reached out and touched Winston's arm as if seeking strength from his expensive fabric. She told me that Winston was right. She said she was tired, Luther. She said she was tired of waiting for the big break that never came. She said she wanted to travel, she wanted to wear nice things. She said she loved my sincerity once, but sincerity did not pay for trips to Paris. The words hit me harder than any physical blow. Sincerity, that was the word she used. She used to tell me that she loved me because I was real, because I was solid. Now solid was just another word for stagnant. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. This was not a negotiation. This was a transaction. They were buying me out of my own marriage. They were treating 20 years of history like a hostile corporate takeover. I picked up the check. The paper felt crisp and expensive between my fingers. Winston smirked. He thought he had won. He thought every man had a price, and he had found mine. He reached for his wine glass, ready to toast his victory. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. I looked Winston in the eye. I told him that he could buy this restaurant. I told him he could buy the building we were sitting in. But I told him that my dignity was not for sale. I ripped the check down the middle. The sound was loud and sharp. Winston's smirk vanished. I put the two halves together and ripped them again. I let the pieces of paper snow down onto the table, landing on the untouched bread plate. I told Vanessa that she was free to go. I told her I did not want a woman who could be bought. But I told her that I would not take a single penny of blood money to make her feel better about her betrayal. Winston's face turned a deep, ugly shade of red. He was not used to being told no. He was not used to men like me having pride. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He did not look at me. He looked past me toward the entrance of the restaurant. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. It was a signal. It was a trap. I heard the sirens before I saw the lights. They must have been waiting right outside. The doors to the restaurant burst open. 2 uniformed police officers marched in, their hands resting on their holsters. The restaurant went silent. Every diner stopped eating. Winston pointed a shaking finger at me. He put on a performance worthy of an award. He shouted for help. He shouted that I was violent. He shouted that I was threatening them. He looked at the officers and told them that I was a disgruntled former employee. He lied with an ease that was terrifying. He said I had embezzled money from his company and that when he confronted me, I became aggressive. He said I was harassing his fiancée, pointing at Vanessa. He said I was demanding money, extortion money, and that I had threatened to harm her if he did not pay. I stood there frozen. The pieces of the torn check lay on the table like evidence of a crime I didn't commit. It looked like I had rejected a settlement, or perhaps in the eyes of the law, it looked like a violent outburst. Vanessa put her face in her hands and began to sob. It was a fake sob, a theatrical performance to sell the lie. She was confirming his story with her silence and her tears. The officers did not ask me for my side of the story. They saw a black man in a cheap suit standing over a crying white woman and a wealthy man in a bespoke jacket. They saw the aggression on Winston's face and the tears on Vanessa's. They made their choice before they even reached the table. They grabbed my arms, they spun me around. They slammed my chest against the wall of the restaurant. I felt the cold steel of the handcuffs click onto my wrists. I tried to speak. I tried to tell them that I was the husband. I tried to tell them that this was my anniversary. But Winston spoke over me. He told the officers to take me away. He said he wanted to press full charges. He said I was dangerous. He said I had threatened to kill them. He looked at me as they dragged me out. He mouthed 2 words to me. "You're nothing." As I was shoved into the back of the police cruiser, I looked back at the window of Le Bernardin. I saw them. Winston had sat back down. He was smoothing his jacket. He picked up his wine glass. Vanessa had stopped crying. She was using a napkin to dab her eyes, checking her makeup in her compact mirror. She looked relieved. They clinked their glasses together. They drank. They celebrated. I sat in the dark of the cruiser, the hard plastic seat digging into my back. I had no money. I had no lawyer. I was facing charges of extortion, harassment, and assault. My wife had just stolen my life and handed it to a man who looked at me like garbage. But as the cruiser pulled away, I did not cry. I closed my eyes, and I remembered the look on Winston's face when I tore that check. He was afraid. For a split second, he was afraid because he realized he couldn't control me. They thought this was the end. They thought I would rot in a cell and fade away. They thought they had buried me, but they forgot that I am a mechanic. I know how to take broken things and rebuild them. I know how to get my hands dirty. They didn't bury me. They planted me. And when I get out of this cell, I am going to take back everything they stole with interest. I spent that night in a holding cell that smelled of urine and despair. I used my one phone call to contact the only person I knew who wouldn't judge me. My younger brother, a man who had walked a different path than me, a path I had always disapproved of until now. He didn't ask questions. He just said he would be there in the morning with bail money. I sat on the metal bench and planned. I replayed every conversation, every suspicion I had ignored over the last year. I realized this wasn't a sudden decision. The missing money from our joint account, the late nights Vanessa spent working, the way she had slowly distanced herself from my family. It was all a long con. I realized something else. The envelope. I had torn the check, but I hadn't torn the other papers, the divorce papers. I hadn't signed them. And until I signed them or a judge ordered it, I was still her husband. That meant I still had rights to our assets. I still had a claim on the house Winston was likely planning to move into. And I remembered that Winston was a developer. Developers have secrets. They have permits, they bypassed inspectors, they bribed corners, they cut. If Winston wanted to play dirty, he was about to learn that he was playing with a man who had nothing left to lose. I wasn't just going to fight for my freedom. I was going to dismantle his empire brick by brick. I was going to find out every skeleton in his closet. And Vanessa, I wasn't going to harm her. No, I was going to let her see exactly who Winston was when his money ran dry. I was going to make sure she understood the value of the sincerity she had thrown away. The sun was coming up when the guard unlocked my cell. He told me I made bail. I walked out into the cool morning air. My suit was rumpled, my wrists were bruised. I had $50 in my pocket and a criminal record pending. But as I walked down the steps of the precinct, I felt lighter than I had in years. The lie was over. The war had begun. And I was ready to work. The handcuffs bit into my wrist, cold and unforgiving, as the blue and red lights of the police cruiser painted the walls of Le Bernardin in a chaotic strobe. I sat in the back of the patrol car watching the woman I had protected for 20 years destroy me with a performance worthy of Broadway. Vanessa was sobbing into a linen napkin, her shoulders shaking with a frailty I knew was calculated. She pointed a trembling finger at me and told the officers that I controlled her finances, that I monitored every cent she spent, and that I became violent when she asked for independence. The injustice of it sat in my throat like bile. I was the one who had worked 16-hour days to pay off the $30,000 in credit card debt she had racked up behind my back. I was the one who drove a 10-year-old truck so she could lease a new luxury sedan every 2 years. Now she was twisting my financial responsibility into abuse. The officers did not look at my calloused hands or my cheap suit and see a hard-working man. They saw a threat. Winston stood beside her with a hand on her back, playing the role of the protective savior. He looked at me through the glass of the cruiser with a smirk that was invisible to everyone but me. It was a look of absolute victory. He had not just taken my wife, he had taken my narrative. As the car pulled away, I saw the patrons of the restaurant watching me with a mixture of fear and disdain. To them, I was just a violent husband who had ruined a fine dining experience. I closed my eyes and let the humiliation wash over me, fueling a cold, hard knot of rage in my stomach. They thought this was the end of me, but they did not know that a man who builds engines knows exactly how to take things apart until there is nothing left but scraps. The ride to the precinct was silent, but the detour to my house was deafening. The officers had agreed to escort me home to collect my personal effects before booking me a small mercy that turned into a final act of cruelty. As we pulled onto the street where I had lived for 2 decades, my stomach dropped. My house, the sanctuary I had paid for with sweat and grease, looked like a crime scene. There was a locksmith van in the driveway. A man I did not know was drilling into the front door, destroying the lock I had installed with my own hands. Winston had moved faster than the law. He had evicted me before a judge had even seen a piece of paper. But that was not the worst of it. The front lawn was littered with black plastic garbage bags. They were piled haphazardly near the curb like refuse waiting for collection. One of the bags had split open, spilling my clothes onto the damp grass. My work boots, the ones I had worn every day for 5 years, lay on their side in a puddle of mud. My tools, my livelihood, were tossed in a heap as if they were worthless junk. These were precision instruments I had collected over a lifetime, and seeing them treated with such disrespect hurt more than the handcuffs. Then I saw my truck, my Ford F-150. My pride and joy was parked on the street. Someone had taken a can of red spray paint to the side. The word cheater was scrawled across the driver's side door in jagged, dripping letters. The irony was so thick it choked me. I was the one being replaced. I was the one being discarded. Yet they had branded me with their own sins. I looked at the officer driving the car. He looked away, uncomfortable with the cruelty of the scene. Even he knew this was not justice. This was a demolition. They let me out for 5 minutes. I walked up the driveway, my hands still cuffed in front of me. I could not pick up my clothes. I could not gather my tools. I could only stand there and witness the erasure of my existence. The locksmith looked at me with pity and looked down at his work. The front door opened, and for a second I thought I might see Vanessa. I thought maybe she would have the decency to look me in the eye. But the door remained closed to me. The locks clicked into place. A new key for a new owner. I was a stranger in my own driveway. I looked at the house one last time. I memorized the way the porch light flickered, the same light I had been meaning to fix. I memorized the crack in the walkway I had promised to patch. I let the anger seep into my bones, replacing the blood in my veins. They wanted me gone. Fine, I would leave. But I would not leave quietly. The holding cell smelled of bleach and stale sweat. It was a cold, concrete box designed to strip a man of his humanity. I sat on the metal bench, shivering in my suit jacket. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I closed my eyes and saw the smirk on Winston's face. I saw the fake tears in Vanessa's eyes. I realized then that I had been blind. I had been a mechanic looking at the surface of the engine, ignoring the knocking sound deep inside the block. Vanessa had not just fallen out of love. She had been recruited. Winston did not just want a woman. He wanted a trophy, and he enjoyed the sport of hunting another man's life. When the guard told me I had one phone call, I did not hesitate. Most men in my position would call their wife begging for forgiveness or explanation. Others would call a bail bondsman or a cheap lawyer. I did neither. I walked to the phone on the wall and dialed a number I had memorized but never used. It was a number for emergencies only. Not police emergencies or medical emergencies. Business emergencies. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. It was a deep, gravelly voice that sounded like it had been smoking cigars for 50 years. Samuel Weiss. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him who I was. I told him where I was. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Samuel did not ask why I was in jail. He did not ask if I was guilty. He asked only one question. Is it time? I looked at the graffiti bars of the cell. I thought about my tools rusting in the rain. I thought about the check I had torn up. Yes, I said, it is time. Samuel let out a low breath that might have been a laugh. He told me to sit tight. He told me that bail would be posted within the hour. But then he said something that made the cold cell feel a little warmer. He said that the emergency shareholder meeting for Winston's development firm was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. He said that my proxy vote would be the first item on the agenda. I hung up the phone and sat back down on the bench. A smile touched my lips for the first time that night. Vanessa and Winston thought I was just a mechanic. They thought my hands were only good for turning wrenches. They did not know about the patent I had sold 10 years ago. They did not know that I had silently invested every penny of that sale into the very company Winston was trying to take public. They saw grease under my fingernails, but they did not see the 51% controlling stake I held in a shell corporation that owned their debt. Monday was coming. 0 hour was approaching. They had taken my house. They had taken my truck. They had taken my wife. But on Monday morning, I was going to take their world. I leaned my head against the cold concrete wall and waited for the sound of the guard's keys. The eviction was over. The acquisition was about to begin. The morning sun did not bring warmth, it only brought exposure. I drove my vandalized Ford F-150 through the waking streets of Manhattan, the red spray paint on the door screaming my alleged sins to the world. People on the sidewalk pointed and stared, but I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon. I was not going to a cheap motel to lick my wounds. I was not going to hide in the shadows. I drove straight to 432 Park Avenue, the thin needle of concrete and glass that pierced the sky above Billionaires Row. I pulled the truck up to the main entrance right behind a line of black limousines and luxury SUVs. The valet took one look at my bruised face, my rumpled suit, and the graffiti on my truck, and stepped forward with a look of aggressive dismissal. He told me that deliveries were in the back. He told me that I could not park my junk heap here. I did not argue. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black key fob made of carbon fiber. I tossed it to him. The valet caught it, his eyes widening as he recognized the insignia. It was a master key. It was the kind of key that did not belong to a guest, but to an owner. I walked past him through the revolving glass doors and into a lobby that smelled of white tea and silence. The concierge, a man named Pierre, who prided himself on knowing every face that mattered, looked up from his marble desk. His professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw me. He saw a tired, dirty man who looked like he had spent the night in a cell. But Pierre was a professional. He saw the way I walked. He saw the cold fire in my eyes. He stood up and bowed his head slightly. "Good morning, Mr. King. Welcome home." I nodded and walked to the private elevator. I scanned my hand on the biometric reader. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. There were no buttons inside. The elevator knew where to go. It shot upward, climbing 96 floors in less than a minute. My ears popped. The city fell away beneath me. The noise, the grime, the police station, the humiliation, it all shrank until it was nothing but a gray smudge. The doors opened directly into the penthouse. This was not just an apartment. It was a fortress in the sky. $80 million of glass and steel floating above the world. I stepped onto the white oak floors, my cheap shoes making a hollow sound in the vast empty space. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of New York City. I could see Central Park looking like a small green rug. I could see the rivers. I could see Queens, where my life had just been dismantled. I walked to the wet bar and poured myself a glass of water. I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I looked like a ghost haunting a palace. This was the secret I had kept for 10 years. This was where the money from my patent and my investments had gone. Vanessa thought I spent my nights fixing transmissions. She did not know I spent them here analyzing markets and acquiring assets. She wanted luxury, but she did not understand that true power is not wearing a diamond bracelet. True power is owning the mine. I did not have time to rest. I went into the study, a room lined with servers and monitors that hummed with quiet efficiency. This was the nerve center of my operations. I sat in the leather chair and typed a sequence of commands into the main terminal. A wall of screens flickered to life. I was not just a mechanic, I was a man who believed in insurance. Years ago, I had installed a state-of-the-art security system in my house in Queens. Cameras in every room, microphones in the walls. I had told Vanessa it was to protect us from burglars. I never thought I would use it to protect myself from her. The feed stabilized. I saw my living room. It looked the same, but it felt violated. Winston was there. He had made himself comfortable on my recliner, the leather chair that had molded to my back over a decade of rest. He had a glass of my scotch in his hand. Vanessa was sitting on the arm of the chair, laughing at something he said. She looked radiant. She looked relieved. They were celebrating. They were toasting to their freedom and to the $50,000 they thought bought my silence. I watched them like a hawk watches a field mice. I saw Winston reach out and touch Vanessa's hair. I saw her lean into his touch. It was a knife in my gut twisting slowly. But then the front doorbell rang. I saw Vanessa stiffen. She looked at Winston with confusion. Winston stood up, buttoning his jacket, annoyed at the interruption. He walked to the door and threw it open. On the porch stood Zoe, my daughter, and Connor, my son-in-law. My heart swelled and broke all at once. Zoe looked terrified. Her eyes were red from crying. Connor stood protectively beside her, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. They had heard. News travels fast in our neighborhood. They had come to find me. They had come to defend me. I turned up the volume on the feed. I heard Zoe ask where her father was. She asked why the locks were changed. She asked why my clothes were on the lawn. Winston did not let her finish. He stepped out onto the porch, blocking their entry. He looked at Connor with a sneer that revealed his true soul. He told them that I was gone. He told them that I was a criminal who had been taken away by the police where I belonged. Zoe tried to push past him, calling out for her mother. Vanessa appeared in the doorway. She did not look at her daughter. She looked at the floor. Zoe begged her. She asked her mother to tell the truth. She asked how she could do this to Dad. Vanessa finally looked up, but her eyes were empty. She told Zoe to go home. She said that this was for the best. She said that she was finally happy. Connor stepped forward. He was a good man, a young man who worked hard but struggled to find his footing in a city that ate the weak. He told Winston to step aside. He told Winston that he had no right to be in this house. Winston laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. He looked Connor up and down. He insulted his clothes. He insulted his truck parked at the curb. He called Connor a pathetic, unemployed white boy who was leeching off the family just like I did. He told them that if they did not get off his property, he would call the police and have them arrested for trespassing just like he did with me. My fists clenched on the desk. I watched my daughter recoil as if she had been slapped. I watched Connor swallow his rage for the sake of his wife, pulling her gently away from the door. I saw Winston slam the door in their faces. I saw him turn back to Vanessa and shrug as if he had just shooed away a stray dog. I saw Vanessa pour herself another drink. That was the moment the last ember of love for my wife died. It turned into cold gray ash. I picked up my phone. I dialed Zoe's number. I watched on the screen as she pulled her phone from her pocket, standing on the sidewalk next to my pile of discarded tools. She answered, her voice trembling. "Dad." I told her I was safe. I told her not to cry. I told her to get in the car with Connor and drive. I gave her the address, 432 Park Avenue. She asked me why I was there. She asked if I was working a job. I told her to just come. I told her to trust me. 40 minutes later, the buzzer on my desk rang. The concierge told me my guests had arrived. I told him to send them up. I stood by the elevator doors waiting. When they opened, Zoe and Connor stepped out looking like they had walked onto an alien planet. They were holding hands, gripping each other for balance. They looked at the soaring ceilings, the modern art, the view that stretched to the horizon. They looked at me standing there in my ruined suit. Zoe ran to me. She hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. She smelled like rain and comfort. Connor stood back, his eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of the geometry of the situation. He asked me whose apartment this was. He asked if I was fixing the plumbing. He was trying to find a logical explanation for why a mechanic was standing in a palace. I gently pulled away from Zoe. I motioned for them to follow me to the study. We walked past the dining room table that cost more than Connor made in a year. We entered the room with the wall of screens. The live feed of Winston and Vanessa was still playing on the central monitor. Connor gasped when he saw it. Zoe covered her mouth. They saw the graphs on the side screens. They saw the stock tickers. They saw the files labeled with Winston's company name. I turned to them. I told them to sit down. I told them that everything they thought they knew about me was a lie. I told them that I was not just a mechanic. I told them that for the last 10 years I had been the silent architect of a financial empire. I told them that I owned the building we were standing in. I told them that I owned the debt that Winston was drowning in. I watched the realization wash over them. It was not just shock. It was a shifting of their entire reality. I looked at Connor. I told him that Winston was wrong. I told him he was not trash. I told him that starting Monday morning, he was going to be the head of security for the new board of directors of Winston's development firm. I looked at Zoe. I told her that she was never going to have to worry about rent again. I pointed to the screen where Winston was currently laughing, oblivious to the sword hanging over his head. I told them that Monday was coming. I told them that we were going to take back everything. The confusion in their eyes faded, replaced by a steel resolve that mirrored my own. We were a family again, a smaller family but a stronger one, and we were standing in the war room ready to launch the attack. The silence in the penthouse study was broken only by the hum of cooling fans from the server wall and the rustle of large architectural schematics being unrolled on the mahogany conference table. Connor stood over the blueprints with a focus I had never seen in him before. Winston had called him a loser. He had fired Connor 2 months ago, citing incompetence. But as I watched my son-in-law trace the lines of the Graves Industries flagship project, I saw a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. He was not incompetent. He was dangerous because he knew where the bodies were buried. Connor tapped a finger on the corner of the site plan for the Hudson Yards development. He looked up at me with eyes wide with disbelief. He told me to look at the zoning allocation. He explained that these plans were the originals, the ones he had drawn up before he was let go. He pointed to the commercial sector, the most valuable acreage in the entire portfolio. In the official prospectus Winston sent to shareholders, this land was listed as a prime asset valued at $300 million. But Connor pulled up a digital file from a hidden directory he had backed up before they escorted him from the building. He showed me the transaction log. Winston had initiated a transfer of the land deed 3 days ago. The sale price was $10 million. I felt the mechanic in me take over, analyzing the breakdown. You do not sell a Ferrari for the price of a bicycle unless you are trying to hide the asset or you are burning the garage down. I asked Connor who the buyer was. He typed a few commands into the terminal. The shell company was called Phoenix LLC. It was registered in the Cayman Islands. But Connor dug deeper. He found the digital signature on the incorporation documents. It was buried under layers of legal obfuscation, but the IP address traced back to a private server in the Hamptons, Winston's summer house. I looked at Connor and I saw the realization hit him. Winston was not trying to build a legacy. He was gutting the company. He was selling the most valuable assets to himself for pennies on the dollar before the company went public. He was stealing the copper wiring from the walls before the tenants moved in. Connor slammed his fist on the table. He said that this was why he was fired. He had asked questions about the valuation 6 months ago. Winston had gotten rid of him to keep the looting secret. I put a hand on Connor's shoulder. I told him he was right. I told him that Winston made a mistake. He thought Connor was just a disposable employee. He did not know he was family. The screen on the wall flickered as Samuel Weiss joined the secure video feed. His face was gray in the blue light of his office. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it accounting. He told me that he had finished the forensic audit of the books I had acquired through my shell corporation. The news was worse than we thought. It was not just the land. It was everything. Samuel pulled up the spreadsheets. The numbers scrolled by in a blur of red ink. There was a $500 million hole in the operating budget. The pension fund for the 3,000 employees of Graves Industries was gone. It had been drained into offshore accounts linked to Vanessa's new diamond bracelet and Winston's private jet. They were not just stealing from investors. They were stealing the retirement of janitors and secretaries and construction workers. They were stealing the future of people who worked with their hands just like me. I felt a cold fury rising in my chest. I thought about the mechanics in my shop. I thought about how hard they worked to save a few dollars a week. Winston was treating these people like livestock. He was harvesting them. Samuel explained the endgame. Winston was planning to announce the sale of the company to a foreign conglomerate at the gala on Monday night. He would take the payout from the sale combined with the assets he had already stolen and vanish. He would leave the empty husk of the company to collapse. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. The investors would be wiped out. And Winston and Vanessa would be sipping champagne on a yacht in the Mediterranean, laughing at the wreckage they left behind. Samuel asked me what I wanted to do. He said we could go to the SEC, we could file an injunction. It would take months. Winston would be gone by then. He would slip through the cracks of the legal system like he always did. I looked at the screen. I looked at the stolen pension fund. I told Samuel that we were not going to the authorities, not yet. We were going to the gala. We were going to look him in the eye when the floor fell out from under him. My phone vibrated on the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I looked at the screen. It was Vanessa. I had not blocked her number. I wanted to see how far she would go. I wanted to see the depth of her cruelty. I picked up the phone. It was a picture message. The photo was grainy, taken in the dim light of our bedroom, the bedroom I was no longer allowed to enter. It showed a watch resting on the velvet tray of a pawn shop counter. It was not an expensive watch. It was a Timex from 1975. The crystal was scratched. The leather strap was worn dark with sweat and oil. It was the watch my father had worn every day of his life. It was the watch he had taken off his wrist on his deathbed and placed in my hand. He told me that time was the only thing a man truly owned and that I should never waste it. I had kept that watch in a safe box in the back of my closet. I never wore it because I was afraid of damaging it. I had trusted Vanessa with the combination. I had told her it was the most valuable thing I owned, not because of money, but because it was the last piece of the man who taught me how to be a man. Below the photo was a text message. Don't bother trying to come back for your junk. I am selling this old thing today. Winston says it is trash, but the pawnbroker offered me $50. Consider it a down payment on your legal fees. Do not contact me again. I stared at the phone. The world narrowed down to that scratched crystal face. $50. She was selling my father's legacy for $50 just to hurt me, just to show me that she could. She did not need the money. Winston was stealing millions. This was pure malice. This was her way of erasing me. She wanted to scrub every trace of Luther King from the earth. I felt a tear run down my cheek. It was hot and angry. I wiped it away with a rough hand. I did not reply. I did not beg. I did not scream. I placed the phone gently face down on the desk. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of planning. It was the silence of a predator that has caught the scent of blood. Connor and Zoe were watching me. They saw the change in my eyes. They saw the mechanic disappear and the CEO take his place. They saw the husband die and the Avenger rise. I looked at Samuel on the screen. I spoke two words that would bring the entire house of cards crashing down. Activate veto. Samuel nodded once. He understood. He typed a command on his keyboard. The transfer of the controlling shares began. The trap was sprung. The 51% stake I had hidden in shell companies and blind trusts was consolidating under a single name. My name. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there in a ballroom preparing for a party, Winston was tying his bow tie. Vanessa was putting on a dress bought with stolen money. They thought they were the kings of New York. They thought they had won. They did not know that the man they threw in the garbage was now the majority shareholder of their existence. I turned back to the room. I told Connor to get his suit. I told Zoe to get ready. I told them we were going to a party. I walked to the closet in the master bedroom. I pushed aside the few clothes I had bought since my release. I reached into the back and pulled out a garment bag that had been hanging there for 5 years waiting for the right occasion. I unzipped it. Inside was a tuxedo. But not just any tuxedo. It was bespoke, cut to fit me like armor. I dressed slowly. I put on the shirt. I fastened the studs. I tied the tie. I looked in the mirror. The grease was gone. The bruises were fading. The man, looking back at me, was not a mechanic. He was not a victim. He was the chairman of the board, and he was late for a meeting. I walked back out to the study. Zoe gasped. Connor straightened his spine. I picked up the printed file containing the evidence of the embezzlement, the land fraud, and the pension theft. I held it like a weapon. I told them that tonight we were not just taking back a company. We were taking back our dignity. We were going to walk into that gala, and we were going to burn it to the ground with the truth. The elevator ride down was silent. Pierre, the concierge, opened the door for us. His eyes widened when he saw the transformation. He signaled for the car, not my truck, the black limousine that belonged to the penthouse. I climbed into the back. I looked at the city passing by. I thought about my father. I thought about his watch sitting in a pawn shop window. I promised him that I would get it back. But first I had to take out the trash. The car turned toward the event center. I could see the paparazzi flashes in the distance. I could see the red carpet. I checked my phone one last time. A notification from the bank. The share transfer was complete. I owned Graves Industries. I owned Winston. I owned the ground they stood on. The car stopped. The driver opened the door. I stepped out onto the pavement. The cameras turned toward me. The murmurs began. They did not recognize me yet. But they would. Oh, yes, they would. I buttoned my jacket. I walked toward the entrance. The sellout was over. The hostile takeover had begun. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel smelled of orchids and unearned wealth. It was a scent I knew well from the cars I fixed, luxury masked by the stench of rot underneath the hood. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the gold leaf ceiling, casting a fractured light over 300 of New York's elite. They held flutes of champagne that cost more than a week of groceries for my mechanics. In the center of it all stood Winston, holding court like a king who had just conquered a new land. He was surrounded by a group of investors from Beijing, men in sharp suits who nodded as Winston gestured wildly at the architectural models displayed on silk-draped tables. I stood in the shadows of the coat check, observing the enemy in his natural habitat. Winston was selling them a dream built on stolen land and embezzled pensions. He laughed, throwing his head back, exposing his throat like a wolf howling at the moon. And right beside him was Vanessa. She wore a dress of emerald silk that clung to her like a second skin, a dress she had bought with the money meant for my retirement. On her neck sat a diamond choker that glittered under the lights. It was new. It was heavy. It looked less like jewelry and more like a collar. She laughed at something Winston said, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her eyes scanning the room, not with love but with the hunger of someone who finally had a seat at the table. She looked radiant and hollow all at once. They were celebrating the sale. They were celebrating the end of Graves Industries and the beginning of their life on the run, though they called it retirement. They were drinking to the destruction of 3,000 jobs. They were drinking to the erasure of Luther King. I watched Vanessa accept a glass of wine from a waiter, and I felt the final tether snap. There was no pain anymore, only the cold precision of a diagnostic check. The engine was dead. It was time to scrap the car. I stepped out from the shadows and walked toward the double doors of the ballroom. I had made a choice back at the penthouse. I had left the bespoke tuxedo in the garment bag. I did not want to look like them. I did not want to play by their rules. I wore my best flannel shirt pressed crisp and clean, tucked into dark denim work pants. On my feet were my Red Wing boots polished to a shine, but still bearing the scuffs of honest labor. I walked into that room not as the chairman of the board, but as the mechanic. I wanted them to know exactly who was taking them down. The silence started at the door and spread like a wave across the room. The string quartet faltered and stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me. They looked at my boots. They looked at my hands. They looked at me as if I were a stain on their pristine white carpet. I heard the whispers ripple through the crowd. Who let the help in? Is that a janitor? Someone call security. I kept walking, my steps heavy and deliberate, echoing on the marble floor. I did not look at the guests. I kept my eyes locked on the stage where Winston and Vanessa stood frozen. Vanessa dropped her glass. It shattered on the floor, sending a spray of red wine across the hem of her emerald dress. She stared at me as if she were seeing a ghost, her face drained of color, the makeup standing out in stark relief against her pale skin. Winston's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure disgust. He stepped in front of Vanessa, shielding his property, not his partner. A wall of black-suited security guards materialized, blocking my path. They were big men, hired muscle paid to keep the rabble out. One of them put a hand on my chest. "Sir, you need to leave immediately. This is a private event." I did not move. I stood my ground, my boots planted firmly. Connor stepped out from behind me. He was wearing a suit I had bought him, but he moved with the aggression of a man defending his family. He shoved the guard's hand away from my chest. "Do not touch him." Connor growled, his voice low and dangerous. Winston saw us. He saw the commotion. He saw an opportunity to twist the knife one last time. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, his voice booming through the speakers, amplified and distorted. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. It seems we have a party crasher." He pointed a manicured finger at me. "This man is a disgruntled former employee, a mechanic who couldn't keep his hands off the merchandise." He looked at Vanessa, who was trembling behind him. "He is a stalker, and he brought his accomplice." Winston turned his gaze to Connor. "And look who it is. The unemployed white boy who thinks he can marry into my company and steal my secrets. Security, get this trash out of my sight. Throw the beggar and his useless son-in-law into the street where they belong." The crowd laughed. It was a nervous, cruel laughter, the sound of people who were relieved they were not the target. Winston smirked, feeling the power of the room behind him. He thought he had won. He thought he could shame me into submission. He thought that by calling me a beggar, he could make me one. The guards surged forward, reaching for my arms. Connor braced himself, ready to fight, ready to take a beating for me. But I did not raise my fists. I did not shout. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I pulled out a single card. It was made of anodized titanium, black and cold to the touch. It was not a credit card. It was an access key. The symbol embossed on the front was a silver phoenix rising from the ashes, the logo of the Shell Corporation that had just purchased 51% of Graves Industries. I held it up. The light caught the metal. "Wait," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. The head of security stopped inches from my face. He looked at the card in my hand. He recognized the symbol. He froze. He looked back at Winston, then at me. He saw the confidence in my eyes. He saw that I was not afraid. I looked at Winston. I looked at Vanessa. I spoke clearly so that every investor, every waiter, and every person in that room could hear. "You can throw me out, Winston. But you cannot throw out the owner of this building. And you certainly cannot throw out the man who just bought your company." The silence that followed was heavier than the grave. I watched Winston's face crumble. I watched the realization dawn on Vanessa. I watched the house of cards begin to fall. The mechanic had come to collect the bill, and the price was everything they had. The head of security took the black titanium card from my hand. He looked at it with the skepticism of a man who had spent his life throwing drunks out of bars. He pulled a slim scanner from his belt and swiped the card. The machine let out a sharp, high-pitched chime that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. A green light bathed the guard's face. He looked at the readout on the small screen. His eyes went wide. The color drained from his cheeks until he looked like a statue made of ash. He looked at me. He looked at the card. He looked at the name displayed on his scanner, which authorized total access to the entire Plaza Hotel infrastructure. He did not grab me. He did not shove me. He took a step back and lowered his head. He handed the card back to me with two hands as if he were returning a holy relic to a priest. "I apologize, Mr. King," he said, his voice trembling loud enough for the front row to hear. "We did not know. Please forgive the interruption." Winston saw this interaction and his face turned a shade of purple I had never seen in nature. He stormed down the steps of the stage, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the polished floor. He grabbed the guard by the lapel of his jacket. "What are you doing?" Winston screamed. "Throw him out! He stole that card. He is a mechanic. He fixes cars for billionaires. He probably swiped it from a glove box while he was changing the oil. Arrest him." The guard gently but firmly removed Winston's hand from his jacket. He looked at Winston with the cold indifference of a man who knows exactly who signs his paycheck. "I cannot do that, sir," the guard said. "Mr. King has higher clearance than you. In fact, Mr. King has higher clearance than anyone in this building." The whisper started in the back of the room and rolled forward like a tide. Higher clearance. Mr. King. The investors from Beijing began to exchange nervous glances. They were money men. They knew that security guards do not bow to mechanics unless the mechanic owns the building. Winston looked around the room, realizing he was losing control of the narrative. He looked at me with pure hatred. He realized that his voice alone was no longer enough to command the room. I put the card back in my pocket. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply started walking toward the stage. The crowd parted for me. Women in ball gowns pulled their skirts back not to avoid my dirt, but to avoid blocking my path. Men who had sneered at me seconds ago now looked at their shoes, terrified of making eye contact. I walked through the sea of tuxedos and diamonds, a shark swimming through a school of ornamental fish. Winston saw me coming. He panicked. He forgot his suit. He forgot his investors. He reverted to the street thug he was beneath the polish. He lunged at me, his fists balled, ready to strike me down physically since he could not do it socially. He wanted to hurt me. He wanted to see me bleed on the white carpet. But he never reached me. Connor stepped into his path. My son-in-law did not look like a boy anymore. He looked like a wall. He caught Winston by the shoulder, one hand clamping down on the expensive fabric of Winston's jacket. Connor did not strike him. He simply applied pressure. He forced Winston back. He looked Winston in the eye and said two words: "Sit down." Winston struggled, but Connor was young and Connor was angry. He shoved Winston back toward the stage stairs. Winston stumbled and fell, sitting hard on the bottom step. It was a clumsy, undignified fall. The illusion of the powerful CEO was shattered. He was just a man in a suit sitting on the floor while the real power walked past him. I climbed the stairs to the stage. I walked to the podium. I tapped the microphone. The sound echoed through the ballroom, a deep thud that silenced the last of the whispers. I looked out at the 500 faces staring up at me. I saw fear. I saw curiosity, but I did not care about them. I turned to my right. Vanessa was standing there. She was clutching her wine glass so hard I thought it would shatter in her hand. She looked at Winston on the floor. She looked at me at the podium. She looked trapped. She looked like an animal caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. I took the microphone from the stand. I did not raise my voice. I spoke to her as if we were the only two people in the room. "Vanessa," I said. She flinched at the sound of her name. "You have spent the last year telling me that I am not enough. You told me that my hands were too dirty. You told me that my dreams were too small. You sold my father's watch for $50 because you wanted to erase me." I took a step closer to her. The stage lights were hot on my face. "But I am still your husband. I am still the man who promised to take care of you. So I am going to ask you one question, and your answer will determine the rest of your life." I pointed at Winston, who was trying to scramble to his feet, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. Then I pointed to myself, standing there in my flannel shirt and work boots. I asked her the question that had been burning in my chest since the moment I walked into Le Bernardin. "Who do you choose, Vanessa? Do you choose the man who bought you with stolen money? Or do you choose the man who built a life with you?" Do you choose the lie, or do you choose the truth? The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Every eye was fixed on Vanessa. The investors, the waiters, the socialites, they all held their breath. This was theater to them. But to me, it was the final autopsy of my marriage. Vanessa looked at Winston. She saw his anger. She saw his desperation. But she also saw his suit. She saw the connections he claimed to have. She saw the illusion of the lifestyle she craved. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the symbol of her new status. Then she looked at me. She looked at my boots. She looked at the grease stain I had intentionally left on my collar. She did not see the man who owned the building. She did not see the man who controlled the company. She only saw the mechanic. She only saw the past she was trying to escape. Her eyes hardened. The fear was replaced by disgust. She made her calculation. She bet on the image instead of the reality. She took a breath and she screamed. "Get out!" she yelled, her voice shrill and ugly. "Get out of here, Luther. You are ruining everything. You are a loser. You are an embarrassment. You are the biggest mistake of my life." She pointed at the door, echoing Winston's earlier command. "Go back to your garage. Go back to your Greece. You do not belong here. You are nothing to me. You are just a stain on my life." The words hung in the air, toxic and final. The crowd gasped. It was a public execution. She had not just chosen Winston. She had chosen to destroy me to save her own social standing. She had chosen to humiliate me to prove her loyalty to the lie. I looked at her. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sadness. I felt a great weight lift off my shoulders. The doubt was gone. The lingering hope that maybe she had been brainwashed was gone. She was not a victim. She was a volunteer. I nodded slowly. "Okay, Vanessa," I said. "I accept your choice." I turned away from her. I looked up at the projection booth at the back of the room where Samuel Weiss was waiting for my signal. I raised my hand. I snapped my fingers. The giant screens behind the stage, which had been displaying the logo of Graves Industries, flickered and went black. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A low bass hum filled the room, growing louder and louder until it vibrated in the floorboards. Then the screens blazed to life. They did not show the Graves logo. They showed a new symbol, a silver phoenix rising from ashes, and underneath it, in bold, stark letters, were two words that signaled the end of Winston's world: Shadow Corp. I turned back to the microphone. "You said I do not belong here, Vanessa. You said I am nothing." I looked at Winston, who had frozen halfway up the stairs. "I am not nothing. I am the new majority shareholder, and I am canceling this party." The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a force that rattled the crystal sconces on the walls. The sound was not a slam, but a declaration of arrival. A hush fell over the room as a phalanx of 6 lawyers marched in. They moved in perfect synchronization like soldiers entering a battlefield. At the head of the formation walked a man who was a legend in the financial district, Samuel Weiss. He was not a tall man, but he cast a shadow that covered the entire room. He wore a 3-piece suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and he carried a briefcase that contained the fate of empires. Winston saw him, and the color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse standing upright. He knew Samuel Weiss. Everyone who worked in high finance knew Samuel Weiss. He was the shark that ate other sharks. He was the man you called when you wanted to burn a company to the ground or save it from the ashes. Winston took a stumbling step back, his arrogant sneer replaced by the terrified look of a man who realizes he is standing on a trap door. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He knew that Weiss did not show up to parties unless he was serving a subpoena or executing a hostile takeover. Weiss walked straight to the stage, ignoring the security guards who parted before him like water. He climbed the stairs with the energy of a man half his age. He did not look at Winston. He did not look at Vanessa. He walked directly to me. He stopped in front of me and bowed his head slightly. It was a gesture of profound respect, a gesture that told the entire room that the hierarchy had shifted. He turned to the microphone. He did not need to raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet authority of absolute power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel said, his eyes scanning the crowd, "you believe you are in the presence of a mechanic. You believe you are looking at a man who fixes your brakes and changes your oil. You are mistaken. You are looking at the silent architect of the modern industrial skyline. You are looking at the man who has been quietly buying the debt of this city for 20 years. You know him as Luther King, the mechanic. The financial world knows him only as the Shadow. A gasp went through the room. The Shadow. It was a name whispered in boardrooms, a mythical figure who moved markets without ever showing his face. Winston began to shake. He looked from Weiss to me, his mind trying to reconcile the grease on my shirt with the legend standing before him. He shook his head, muttering no over and over again. Weiss ignored him. He gestured to the technician in the booth. "Show them," he commanded. The massive screens behind us shifted again. The logo of Shadow Corp faded and was replaced by a complex web of financial data. It was a graph of ownership, a pie chart that displayed the distribution of shares for Graves Industries. A thick red line circled the largest slice of the pie. The number inside the circle was 51%. The room erupted in whispers. 51%. Controlling interest. But then the screen changed again, displaying the total valuation of the assets held by Shadow Corp. The number was so large it seemed abstract. $10 billion. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of 500 people realizing they were standing in the presence of a titan. I stood there in my work boots and flannel shirt while the screen behind me proclaimed a net worth that eclipsed the combined wealth of everyone else in the room. Weiss tapped a button on a remote. The screen began to scroll through a timeline. It showed dates going back 20 years. November 2004. Graves Industries faces bankruptcy. An anonymous injection of capital saves the payroll. March 2008. The housing crash threatens to liquidate the assets. Shadow Corp buys the toxic debt and stabilizes the stock. June 2015. A hostile takeover attempt by a rival firm is blocked by a massive purchase of voting shares. The crowd watched the history of the company unfold. They saw the truth. Winston had not built this company. He had been piloting a ship that I had been keeping afloat from the engine room. Every time he made a mistake, I fixed it. Every time he gambled with the employees' futures, I covered the bet. I had saved this company 3 times while fixing transmissions in Queens. I looked out at the faces in the crowd. The sneers were gone. The disdain had evaporated. In its place was fear and awe. The investors from Beijing who had been laughing at me 5 minutes ago were now looking at me with reverence. They knew what $10 billion looked like, and they knew it did not matter what kind of shoes it wore. They realized that while they were playing checkers, I had been playing chess for 2 decades. I saw the shift in their posture. They turned their backs on Winston, physically distancing themselves from the failure and aligning themselves toward the power. I stepped forward. The stage lights felt different now. They did not feel like an interrogation lamp. They felt like a spotlight. I looked at the graph behind me. It was not just money. It was my life's work. It was every late night, every missed holiday, every drop of sweat. I had built this fortune not for greed, but for security. I had built it to protect my family, and now I was using it to expose the people who had tried to destroy that family. Vanessa stood frozen near the edge of the stage. Her eyes were fixed on the screen on the number that said $10 billion. Her mouth was slightly open, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the one Winston had given her. It looked like a toy now. It looked like costume jewelry compared to the empire she had just thrown away. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, she really saw me. She did not see the husband she was bored with. She saw the most powerful man in New York. And she saw that he was a stranger. Near the front row, Beatrice, my mother-in-law, stood clutching her pearl necklace. She had always hated me. She had called me a blue-collar nobody. She had told Vanessa on her wedding day that she was marrying beneath her. She stared at the screen, her eyes rolling back in her head. The realization was too much for her heart to handle. The fortune she had spent a lifetime chasing had been sitting at her dinner table for 20 years, and she had treated it like a servant. She let out a soft moan and collapsed. Her body hit the floor with a dull thud. People rushed to help her, but Vanessa did not move. She was paralyzed by the magnitude of her mistake. She held a glass of red wine in her hand, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Winston, who was slumped on the stairs, a broken man. She looked at me standing tall beside Samuel Weiss. The tremors in her hand became violent. The glass slipped from her fingers. It fell in slow motion. It hit the floor right next to her feet. The crystal shattered. The dark red wine exploded upward, splashing across the skirt of her pristine white gown. The stains spread, instantly soaking into the expensive fabric like a fresh wound. It looked like blood on snow. It was a mark that would never wash out, a permanent reminder of the night she lost everything. She looked down at the stain, her eyes wide with horror. She tried to brush it away, but her hands only smeared it, making it larger and uglier. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg to explain, but no words came out. There were no words left. The stain said everything. She was ruined. I walked back to the microphone. I did not look at Beatrice being fanned by waiters. I did not look at Vanessa frantically scrubbing at her dress. I looked at Winston. He was trying to stand up, trying to regain some shred of dignity. He straightened his jacket, but his hands were shaking. He looked at me with the eyes of a rat that knows the trap has snapped shut. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. The sale of Graves Industries to the foreign conglomerate is canceled, effective immediately. A murmur went through the crowd. The investors from Beijing began to type furiously on their phones. I continued, my voice hard as steel. Furthermore, as the majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to restructure the leadership of this company. We are going to conduct a full forensic audit of every transaction made in the last 5 years. We are going to find every penny that was stolen from the pension fund. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at Winston. Winston Graves, you are fired. You are banned from this building. You are banned from every property owned by Shadow Corp. Security will escort you out. And Winston, do not try to leave the country. My lawyers have already filed for an immediate freeze on your assets and surrendered your passport to the authorities. Winston opened his mouth to scream, to protest, to fight. But 2 security guards, the same ones he had ordered to throw me out, grabbed him by the arms. They did not be gentle. They dragged him backward, his heels dragging on the floor, his protest turning into incoherent sobbing. I looked at the crowd one last time. The party is over, I said. Go home. I turned my back on them. I walked toward Connor and Zoe, who were waiting for me in the wings. I did not look back at Vanessa, standing alone in her stained dress in the center of the empty dance floor. I had taken back my name, I had taken back my company, and I had left them with nothing but the truth. The silence that had fallen over the ballroom did not last. It was shattered, not by applause or by questions, but by a scream that sounded like metal tearing apart. Winston Graves did not accept defeat. He did not accept reality. The image of the $10 billion valuation on the screen behind me burned into his retinas, and it broke his mind. He looked at the investors from Beijing who were now turning their backs on him. He looked at the security guards who refused to obey his orders. He looked at me, the mechanic standing on his stage, owning his company, and he snapped. He lunged forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. He screamed that I was a fraud. He screamed that the numbers were fake. He screamed that I was a con artist who had hacked the system. He grabbed a heavy crystal award from the podium, a trophy celebrating his supposed leadership, and he smashed it against the lectern. Shards of glass flew into the air, catching the stage lights like diamonds. He did not care who he hit. He did not care about the damage. He wanted to destroy the stage because he could no longer control the play. He swept his arm across the table, sending architectural models crashing to the floor. The miniature skyscrapers he had promised to build lay broken at his feet. He was panting, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pointed a shaking finger at Samuel Weiss, accusing him of collusion, accusing him of theft. But Samuel just watched him with the cold disinterest of a man watching a bug writhe on a pin. Winston realized that words were failing him. He realized that no one was listening. He needed to make us feel his pain physically. He turned his eyes to me. I saw the murder in them. It was the same look he had given me in the restaurant when he had me arrested, but now it was desperate. He roared a sound of pure primal rage and charged. He lowered his shoulder like a linebacker aiming for my chest. He wanted to tackle me off the stage. He wanted to break my bones to prove he was still powerful. I braced myself, ready to fight, ready to defend the ground I had just claimed. But I did not have to. A blur of motion shot out from the wings of the stage. It was Connor. My son-in-law did not hesitate. He did not wait for permission. He saw a threat to his family, and he became a wall. He stepped directly into Winston's path. Winston was running full speed, fueled by adrenaline and hatred. He collided with Connor with a sickening thud of meat hitting meat. Connor took the full force of the impact. He grunted as the air left his lungs, but he did not give an inch. Winston flailed, throwing a wild punch that caught Connor on the cheekbone. The skin split. Bright red blood welled up and ran down Connor's face, staining the white collar of the shirt I had bought him. It was the only stain I was proud of that night. Connor did not strike back. He did not lose control. He wrapped his arms around Winston in a bear hug, trapping Winston's arms against his sides. He squeezed. He used the strength of a man who worked double shifts to support his wife. He lifted Winston off his feet, depriving him of leverage. Winston kicked and screamed, spitting saliva and curses, but he was helpless against the iron grip of a man who fought for love instead of greed. I looked at Connor holding the thrashing CEO, and I felt a lump in my throat that had nothing to do with fear. Winston had called him useless. Winston had called him trash. But I saw a king. I saw a man who was willing to bleed to protect the people he cared about. I saw the son I had always wanted. I saw the future of my family. Connor looked at me over Winston's shoulder. His eye was already swelling shut, and blood was dripping onto the floor, but he nodded at me. He was telling me he had this. He was telling me that he would always have my back. "Hold him," I said, my voice calm amidst the chaos. "Just hold him, son." Connor tightened his grip. Winston's struggles began to weaken as the oxygen was squeezed from his chest. He hung there suspended and defeated a man in an expensive suit being subdued by a boy in a budget tuxedo. The crowd watched in horrified fascination. They saw the violence, but they also saw the loyalty. They saw the difference between a paid bodyguard and a devoted son. Then the doors at the back of the room burst open for the second time that night. But this time it was not a mistake. This time it was not a false report. 6 officers from the NYPD Financial Crimes Division marched into the ballroom. They did not look confused. They looked focused. They had the evidence package I had sent to the district attorney 3 hours ago. They had the bank records. They had the proof of the stolen pension funds. They walked up the aisle, the crowd parting for them with a mixture of fear and respect. They climbed the stairs to the stage. The lead detective, a woman with eyes like flint, nodded to Connor. "You can let him go now, son," she said. "We will take it from here." Connor released his grip. Winston dropped to his knees, gasping for air. He looked up at the detective. He tried to straighten his tie. He tried to summon the arrogant persona that had shielded him for so years. He tried to speak to tell them that this was a misunderstanding, that I was the criminal. But the detective did not let him speak. She pulled a pair of handcuffs from her belt. They were not the cheap cuffs they had used on me. They were heavy duty. She grabbed Winston's wrists and pulled them behind his back. The click of the ratchet was the loudest sound in the room. It echoed off the vaulted ceiling, signaling the end of an era. "Winston Graves, you are under arrest for grand larceny, securities fraud, and embezzlement," the detective recited. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." Winston began to weep. It was an ugly sound. The sound of a narcissist realizing the mirror has broken. He looked out at the crowd, searching for an ally, searching for someone, anyone who could save him. He saw the investors turning away. He saw the socialites taking photos with their phones documenting his downfall. He realized he was alone. He looked at Vanessa. She was still standing in the center of the stage, paralyzed by the wine stain on her dress and the destruction of her dreams. Winston screamed her name. He begged her to call his lawyer. He begged her to tell them who he was. He shouted that he did it for her. He shouted that she was the one who wanted the money. He tried to drag her down with him, desperate to share the blame. Vanessa recoiled. She took a step back, her heels clicking on the floor. She looked at him with absolute revulsion. She did not see a lover. She saw a liability. She saw a sinking ship, and she was a rat trying to swim. She turned her head away, refusing to meet his eyes. The officers hauled Winston to his feet. He was dead weight. His legs dragged across the stage, the toes of his Italian shoes scuffing on the same floor where he had planned to celebrate his victory. He screamed and cried, begging for mercy, begging for a deal, but the doors closed behind him, cutting off his wails. I stood on the stage next to Connor. I took a handkerchief from my pocket and handed it to him. He pressed it to his cheek, stemming the flow of blood. We stood there, 2 men who had been discarded by the people we loved, watching the justice system work. I looked at Vanessa. She was the only one left. The stage was empty except for us. The screen behind me still glowed with the logo of Shadow Corp. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked at me with eyes that were wide and wet. She took a hesitant step toward me. She opened her mouth, perhaps to say my name, perhaps to say she was sorry, perhaps to say she made a mistake. I did not let her speak. I did not want to hear her voice. I did not want her apologies. They were counterfeit currency, and I was not buying. I turned to Connor. I put my arm around his shoulders. "Let's go home," I said. We walked down the stairs. We walked past Vanessa without breaking stride. I did not look at her. I did not look at the stain on her dress. I left her standing there, alone in the spotlight, surrounded by the wreckage of the party she had thrown to celebrate my demise. She was the queen of nothing. And as we walked out of the ballroom, leaving the whispers and the flashbulbs behind, I felt the weight of 20 years finally fall away. I was free. I was Luther King, and I had a company to run. 3 days is a lifetime in New York City when you have no money. It is enough time for the gossip columns to chew you up and spit you out. It is enough time for the banks to freeze every asset linked to a federal investigation. And it is enough time for a woman who thought she was a queen to realize she is just a tenant with an expired lease. Vanessa found this out the hard way. The police had seized Winston's assets within hours of his arrest. The townhouse she had moved into, the one with the marble floors and the staff, was sealed with yellow tape. She had been escorted out onto the sidewalk with nothing but a Louis Vuitton bag filled with clothes she could no longer afford to dry clean. I watched her approach 432 Park Avenue from the monitors in my study. She did not look like the woman in the emerald dress anymore. She was wearing a trench coat that looked slept in. Her hair, usually sprayed into submission, was pulled back in a severe knot that highlighted the sharp angles of her face. She walked with her head down, trying to hide from the paparazzi who were camped out waiting for a glimpse of the shadow. She pushed through the revolving doors and marched up to the concierge desk. Pierre looked at her with the same professional detachment he used for delivery drivers. I turned up the volume on the feed. I heard her demand to see me. She used her old voice, the one she used on waiters when the soup was cold. She told Pierre that she was my wife. She told him that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. Pierre simply looked at his computer screen. He told her that Mr. King was not accepting visitors. Then the facade cracked. The entitlement evaporated, leaving only raw panic. She grabbed Pierre's hand across the marble counter. She begged. Her voice cracked into a high, thin whine. She told him she had nowhere to go. She told him she had no money for a hotel. She told him she was hungry. It was a pathetic display. A woman who had toasted to my destruction was now pleading for a crumb of mercy from my doorman. I pressed the intercom button. I told Pierre to send her up. I wanted to see this. I needed to see the end of the story. I needed to look her in the eye one last time, not as a victim, but as the architect of her fate. The elevator ride takes 60 seconds to reach the 96th floor. I stood by the window looking out at the gray skyline, waiting. When the doors hissed open, Vanessa stepped out. She stopped. She looked at the vast expanse of the penthouse, the art on the walls, the view that cost millions. She let out a small breath that sounded like a sob. She looked at me. I was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, holding a cup of coffee. I looked comfortable. I looked like a man at peace. She ran to me. She dropped her bag on the floor and threw herself at my feet. She did not hug me. She knelt. She grabbed my hand and pressed her face against my knuckles. Her skin was cold. She smelled of stale perfume and fear. She began to cry. It was the same performance she had given in the restaurant, but this time the tears were real because they were for herself. "Luther," she sobbed. "Oh God, Luther, I am so sorry. You have to believe me. It was not my fault. It was Winston. He forced me. He brainwashed me. He told me he would kill you if I did not go along with it." I looked down at the top of her head. It was a lie, a desperate, clumsy lie. Winston was a thief, but he was not violent until the end. Vanessa had gone willingly. She had gone eagerly. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks. She tried to summon the ghost of the woman I used to love. She softened her voice. She tilted her head in the way that used to make me forgive her anything. "Remember us, Luther," she whispered. "Remember the studio apartment. Remember the way we used to laugh. 15 years. We have 15 years of history. You cannot just throw that away because of one mistake." I was confused. I was scared. My mother pressured me. "Beatrice told me you were holding me back. I was weak, Luther, but I never stopped loving you. Not really. Deep down, I always knew you were the one." She stood up slowly, her hands sliding up my arms. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. She tried to use her body, the weapon that had worked on me for 2 decades. She touched my chest. She looked at my lips. She tried to ignite a fire that had been extinguished by betrayal. I did not move away. I simply looked at her with the curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. I felt nothing. No anger, no desire, no pity, just a cold hollowness where my heart used to be. She mistook my silence for hesitation. She leaned in, closing her eyes, puckering her lips, expecting a kiss, expecting reconciliation, expecting to be saved. I stepped back. Her eyes snapped open, confusion clouding her face. I walked to the desk in the center of the room. I picked up a cream-colored envelope. It was thick and heavy. It was identical to the one Winston had slid across the table at Le Bernardin. The symmetry was perfect. I held it out to her. She looked at the envelope. Hope flared in her eyes. She thought it was a check. She thought I was giving her money. She thought I was buying her off just like Winston tried to do, but she did not care. Money was survival. She snatched the envelope from my hand, tearing it open with trembling fingers. She pulled out the contents. There were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a legal document, a petition for divorce. It listed the grounds as adultery, fraud, and cruel and inhuman treatment. It was already signed by me. The second piece of paper was smaller. It fluttered to the floor. Vanessa bent down and picked it up. She stared at it. Her brow furrowed. It was a ticket. A Greyhound bus ticket. One way. She looked at the destination. It was not Paris. It was not Milan. It was for a small town in Ohio where her aunt lived, a place she had sworn she would never visit again because it was too boring and too poor. The departure time was in 2 hours. She looked up at me. The hope vanished. The seduction vanished. The tears dried up instantly. Her face hardened into a mask of pure venom. She realized there was no check, there was no settlement, there was no rescue, there was only the exit. "You are joking," she said, her voice low and shaking with rage. "You think this is funny. You have $10 billion, Luther. $10 billion. And you give me a bus ticket." "It is more than you gave me, Vanessa," I said, my voice calm. "You gave me a prison cell. I am giving you transportation." She threw the papers on the floor. She stepped toward me, her hands curled into claws. The mask was completely gone now. The monster underneath was revealed. "I am your wife," she screamed. "I was with you when you were nothing. I deserve half. Do you hear me, Luther? I deserve half of everything. We do not have a prenuptial agreement. The law says I get 50%. I will sue you. I will drag you through court for years. I will take this penthouse. I will take your company. I will bleed you dry until you are back under a car fixing transmissions where you belong." She was panting, her chest heaving. She looked ugly in her greed. She looked exactly like Winston. I shook my head slowly. "You really did not pay attention, did you, Vanessa?" I walked to the door and opened it. Pierre was standing there with 2 security guards. They looked at Vanessa with stone faces. "You signed a document 3 years ago, Vanessa. Do you remember? When I took out the loan to expand the garage. You signed a waiver of marital assets to protect yourself from my potential debt. You wanted to make sure that if I failed, the bank could not take your jewelry." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. "That waiver works both ways. It separates our assets completely. You signed away your claim to my business ventures to protect your shoe collection. My lawyers have already filed it with the divorce petition. You get nothing. Not half. Not a percentage. Nothing." Vanessa froze. She remembered. I saw the memory hit her like a physical blow. She had been so eager to protect her petty comforts that she had signed away a fortune she did not know existed. She opened her mouth to scream, to curse, to spit poison, but the guards stepped forward. They took her by the arms. "You have a bus to catch," I said. They dragged her toward the elevator. She kicked and screamed, threatening me, threatening the guards, threatening the world, but the doors closed, cutting off her voice. The silence returned to the penthouse. I looked at the envelope on the floor. I picked up the bus ticket and tore it in half. I dropped the pieces in the trash. She could walk to Ohio for all I cared. The transaction was complete. The books were balanced, and I was finally alone. The conference room of the law firm smelled of leather polish and intimidation. It was a corner office on the 45th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. The view was spectacular, but the atmosphere inside was toxic. Vanessa sat on the other side of the mahogany table. She was not wearing the stained dress from the gala. She was wearing a power suit she had likely bought on credit just that morning. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her face was a mask of cold determination. She looked like a woman who had convinced herself that she was the victim. Beside her sat Marcus Thorne. I knew of him. He was a divorce attorney who called himself the Vulture. He was famous for tearing wealthy men apart and leaving them with nothing but their socks. He charged $1,000 an hour, and he did not take cases unless he smelled blood. Vanessa must have gone to a loan shark to pay his retainer. She was gambling with money she did not have on a fight she could not win. Thorne leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me with a smirk that was meant to be disarming. He looked at my flannel shirt, which I had worn to the meeting on purpose. He thought he was dealing with a lucky mechanic who had stumbled into a fortune. He did not know he was sitting across from the man who owned the building his firm rented. Mr. King Thorne began, his voice smooth as oil. Let us not waste time. We know the numbers. We know about the $10 billion valuation of Shadow Corp. We know about the real estate portfolio, and we know that under New York state law, my client is entitled to an equitable distribution of marital assets. He slid a document across the table. It was thick. It was heavy. We are prepared to settle quietly, Thorne said. We want $5 billion, plus a monthly alimony of $200,000 to maintain the lifestyle Mrs. King has become accustomed to. In exchange, we will sign a non-disclosure agreement. We will not tell the press about your abusive behavior or your financial infidelity. I looked at Vanessa. She was staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. She was shaking slightly. She knew she was lying. She knew there was no abuse. But she had convinced herself that $5 billion was fair compensation for her time. She wanted half of the empire I had built while she was sleeping with another man. She wanted to be paid for her betrayal. I did not speak. I looked at Samuel Weiss, who was sitting next to me. Samuel did not look worried. He looked bored. He opened his briefcase. The click of the latches sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not crisp and white like the lawsuit Thorne had presented. It was old. The edges were yellowed. The paper was thin. Samuel placed it on the table. He did not slide it. He set it down with a gentle, deliberate motion. He smoothed it out with his hand. Mr. Thorne, Samuel said, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. Before you calculate your fee, I suggest you read this. It is a document dated 15 years ago. It was signed by your client in our kitchen in Queens. It was notarized by a neighborhood clerk who is prepared to testify to its authenticity. Thorne picked up the paper. He adjusted his glasses. He began to read. I watched his face. I saw the smirk vanish. I saw his eyebrows knit together. I saw the blood drain from his cheeks. He looked at the signature at the bottom. Then he looked at Vanessa. What is this? Thorne asked, his voice tight. Vanessa looked up. She squinted at the paper. Then her eyes went wide. She remembered. I watched the memory hit her. I remembered that day vividly. It was a rainy Tuesday 15 years ago. I had come home from the shop covered in grease, looking defeated. I told her that the business was failing. I told her that creditors were coming after me. I told her that I was drowning in debt and that they might come for our personal assets. I told her they might take her car. They might take her jewelry. I was testing her. I wanted to see if she would stand by me in the storm. I wanted to see if she was a partner or a passenger. She had panicked. She screamed at me for being a failure. She asked how I could do this to her. She demanded a way to protect her things. So I presented her with a document. It was a post-nuptial agreement. It stated that our assets were completely separate. It stated that my debts were mine alone, and her assets were hers alone. It stated that any future earnings or business ventures were the sole property of the individual who created them. I told her it was to protect her from my debt. She signed it without reading the fine print. She signed it so fast the ink barely had time to dry. She wanted to make sure that when the ship went down, she would not get wet. She did not know that the ship was not sinking. She did not know that I was building a submarine. Thorne looked at me. He looked at the document. He realized what it meant. It was ironclad. It was a complete waiver of marital assets. By signing it to protect her petty possessions 15 years ago, she had legally severed herself from my entire fortune. She had signed away her claim to Shadow Corp before it even had a name. This is a trick, Vanessa stammered. He lied to me. He told me he was broke. He tricked me into signing it. He did not trick you, Mrs. King, Samuel said. The document clearly states that it separates all assets past, present, and future. You signed it voluntarily to avoid liability for potential debts. You cannot claim the benefits of a partnership you legally dissolved 15 years ago to save your own skin. The law does not reward fair-weather wives. Thorne dropped the paper. It floated down to the table, landing on top of his lawsuit. He looked at Vanessa with disgust. He realized he had been played. He realized there was no $5 billion. There was no settlement. There was only a piece of paper that proved his client was greedy and short-sighted. But I was not finished. I nodded to Samuel. He reached into his briefcase again. This time he pulled out a thick stack of financial records. They were credit card statements, they were bank transfers, they were surveillance photos. "We are countersuing," Samuel announced. Thorne looked up weary. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds of theft, fraud, and misappropriation of funds," Samuel said. He opened the file. He laid out the photos. They showed Vanessa and Winston at dinners. They showed them at hotels. They showed Winston wearing a Rolex watch. They showed Vanessa wearing diamond earrings. Then Samuel laid out the bank statements. They were from a supplementary credit card account attached to my primary business line. I had given Vanessa that card for emergencies. I had told her it was for household expenses. "You see, Mr. Thorne," Samuel continued, pointing to the highlighted line items, "your client used Mr. King's funds to finance her affair. She bought Mr. Graves a $20,000 watch with Mr. King's money. She paid for their hotel suites with Mr. King's money. She even paid for the deposit on the townhouse she planned to move into with Mr. King's money." I leaned forward. I looked Vanessa in the eye. "That is not alimony, Vanessa," I said. "That is theft. You stole from me to pay for the man you were leaving me for. You committed fraud, and under New York law, that is a felony." Vanessa began to cry, but this time it was not a performance. It was the terrified sobbing of a woman who realizes the walls are closing in. She looked at Thorne, begging him to do something, begging him to find a loophole. Thorne stood up. He closed his folder. He picked up his briefcase. He looked at Vanessa, not as a client, but as a liability. "I cannot represent you," Mrs. Kingthorne said. "I cannot represent a client who has committed verifiable fraud and who has signed away her rights to the estate she is suing for. You did not disclose this document to me. You did not disclose the theft. You are on your own." He turned to me. He nodded briefly, a warrior acknowledging a superior adversary. Then he walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound was final. Vanessa sat alone at the massive table. The silence was heavy. She looked at the yellowed paper from 15 years ago. She looked at the photos of her and Winston. She looked at me. "Luther, please," she whispered. "I have nothing. Winston is in jail. My parents have disowned me. I have nowhere to go. You cannot leave me like this." I stood up. I buttoned my flannel shirt. I picked up the old yellowed document and folded it carefully, putting it back in my pocket. It was more valuable than the $10 billion. It was the receipt for my freedom. "I am not leaving you like this, Vanessa," I said. "You did this to yourself 15 years ago. You chose your shoes over my future. Now you have your shoes. I suggest you start walking." I walked out of the conference room with Samuel right behind me. We left her sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of her own greed. The legal trap had snapped shut. She was not just divorced. She was indigent. She was not just broke. She was a criminal. And I was finally completely free. Winston Graves did not stay in jail long. Rats like him always have one last bolt hole, one final favor to call in. He managed to post bail using money he borrowed from men who do not use contracts but instead use baseball bats to enforce repayment. He walked out of Rikers Island looking thinner and older, but his eyes still burned with that specific madness of a man who believes the world owes him everything. He did not go into hiding. He did not flee the country. His arrogance was a terminal disease. He decided to strike back. I was in the penthouse study reviewing the transition documents for the new board of directors when my phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a photograph. The image was taken from a distance through a car window. It showed Zoe walking out of her apartment building. She was smiling, holding Connor's hand. There was a red digital crosshair superimposed over her face. Beneath the image was a text. "You took my company. I take your heart. Back off, or she bleeds." My blood ran cold. It was the kind of cold that starts in the marrow and freezes you from the inside out. He was threatening my daughter. He was threatening the only pure thing left in my life. I did not panic. I did not call the police immediately. Police take reports, they file paperwork. They react after the crime has happened. I needed to stop the crime before it began. I needed to cut off the head of the snake. I called Connor. I told him to take Zoe and go to the safe house I had prepared in upstate New York. I told him to take the security detail I had hired. I told him not to stop for anything. Connor heard the tone in my voice. He did not ask questions. He just said, "Consider it done." Then I called Samuel Weiss. Samuel answered on the first ring. I told him what Winston had done. I told him about the threat. Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I did not want to send thugs. I did not want to break his legs. I wanted to break his soul. I wanted to destroy his ability to ever harm anyone again. I wanted to make him so radioactive that even the loan sharks would run from him. "Activate the short squeeze," I said. Samuel hesitated. "Luther," he said, "that is the nuclear option. If we dump his personal portfolio now, we will lose money too. We will tank the market for his specific holdings." "I do not care about the money," I said. "I want him at zero. I want him in the negative. I want him to owe money to the air he breathes." Samuel typed the command. The war began not with guns, but with algorithms. Winston still had a personal portfolio separate from Graves Industries. He had investments in tech stocks and foreign currencies, in luxury real estate funds. It was his retirement plan. It was his escape fund. I watched the screens. The numbers began to move. We flooded the market with sell orders for every stock Winston owned. We drove the price down, artificially creating a panic. Other investors, seeing the drop, began to sell too. It was a domino effect. The value of Winston's portfolio plummeted. In 10 minutes, he lost $5 million. In 20 minutes, he lost 10. But I was not done. I told Samuel to pull up the list of Winston's creditors. I knew he had borrowed money to pay his bail. I knew he had mortgages on his summer homes. I knew he had lines of credit with 3 major banks. Buy the debt I ordered. Samuel worked his magic. He contacted the banks. He contacted the private lenders. He offered them 100 cents on the dollar for Winston's debt. The banks were happy to unload a high-risk client. The private lenders, the ones who break legs, were even happier to get their cash immediately without having to get their hands dirty. Within an hour, I owned Winston Graves. I owned his mortgage. I owned his car loans. I owned the personal loan he had taken out to pay the hitman who was stalking my daughter. I was his landlord, his banker, and his executioner. I watched the final transaction clear. I saw the notification that the transfer of the deed to his Hampton estate was complete. I saw the notification that his credit cards were canceled. I saw the notification that his bank accounts were frozen due to suspected insolvency. He was done. He just did not know it yet. He was sitting in his mansion in the Hamptons, probably drinking expensive scotch, thinking he had scared me. He thought the threat against Zoe would make me back down. He did not understand that threatening a man's child does not make him retreat. It makes him relentless. I stood up. I put on my coat. I called the head of my security team. I told him to ready the car. We were going to the Hamptons. We were going to deliver the eviction notice personally. The drive to the Hamptons was long and quiet. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and high hedges of the billionaire enclave. I looked out the window, watching the trees blur by. I thought about the man Winston used to be. He was always ambitious, always hungry. But somewhere along the way, he lost his humanity. He started believing his own lies. He started believing that people were just stepping stones. We pulled up to the gate of Winston's estate. It was a sprawling monstrosity of white stone and columns, a testament to his ego. The gate was locked. A security camera turned toward the car. I did not buzz the intercom. I signaled my driver. He drove the heavy armored SUV straight through the iron gates. The metal shrieked and twisted. The lock snapped. The gates swung open, banging against the stone pillars. We drove up the long driveway. I saw Winston standing on the front porch. He was wearing a bathrobe. He had a glass in his hand. He looked confused. He probably thought it was the hitman coming for payment, or perhaps the police coming to ask questions. He did not expect me. I stepped out of the car. I was followed by 4 security guards and 2 uniformed police officers I had called ahead to enforce the eviction. I walked up the steps. I held a large metal sign in my hand. It was a standard real estate sign, but the words on it were custom made. Property of Shadow Corp. No trespassing. Winston stared at me. He dropped his glass. It shattered on the porch steps. He looked at the sign. He looked at the police officers. His face went gray. He tried to speak, but only a croak came out. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. "You cannot be here. I have protection." "Your protection works for me now, Winston," I said. "I bought your debt. I bought the loan you took out to pay for the hitman. I own the man you hired. And I told him that if he ever goes near my daughter again, I will personally bury him under the foundation of this house." Winston stumbled back. He grabbed the doorframe for support. He looked like a man waking up from a dream into a nightmare. "You cannot do this," he stammered. "This is my house. I built this. You built nothing." I said, walking closer, "You stole this. You stole the money from the company to buy the land. You stole the materials from the job sites to build the walls. And you stole the pension fund to pay the taxes. This house is a crime scene, Winston, and I am the evidence." I slammed the metal sign into the lawn right next to the front steps. The sound of the metal stakes driving into the earth was final. "You are trespassing," I said. "You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises. If you are not off my property in 5 minutes, these officers will arrest you for criminal trespass. And since you are out on bail for fraud, a new arrest will revoke your bond. You will go straight back to Rikers, and this time you will stay there." Winston looked at the police officers. They nodded, confirming my words. He looked at the sign. He looked at his beautiful house, the symbol of everything he thought he had achieved. He realized it was over. The money was gone. The power was gone. The fear he used to command was gone. He clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain. He gasped for air. It was not a performance this time. I saw the sweat break out on his forehead. I saw his lips turn blue. The stress, the shock, the collapse of his entire world was too much for his heart. He fell to his knees. He reached out a hand toward me, begging for help, begging for mercy. "Luther," he wheezed, "please, my heart." I looked down at him. I remembered Richard, my brother, who died because he could not afford the surgery Winston denied coverage for. I remembered the 3,000 employees who lost their savings. I remembered the threat against Zoe. I took out my phone. I dialed 911. "I am reporting a medical emergency," I told the operator. "Address is 124 Ocean Drive." "Yes, send an ambulance." I hung up. I did not kneel beside him. I did not hold his hand. I let the police officers tend to him. I watched as he gasped on the porch of the house he no longer owned. I turned around and walked back to the car. I had saved his life by calling the ambulance, but I had ended his existence. He would survive the heart attack, but he would wake up handcuffed to a hospital bed with nothing to his name but a hospital gown. The collapse was complete. The empire was dust, and the shadow had finally cleared. The antiseptic smell of the county hospital was a sharp contrast to the lavender and money scent of the Plaza Hotel. I stood in the doorway of room 402, watching the man who used to be a king. Winston Graves was not dead. Death would have been too easy. He had survived his heart attack, but the stroke that followed had left him partially paralyzed on his left side. He lay in a bed with thin sheets in a ward he shared with 3 other men. There were no private nurses here. There were no fresh flowers. There was only the rhythmic beeping of a monitor and the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed overhead. He was handcuffed to the bed frame. The metal cuff chafed against his wrist, a constant reminder that as soon as he could walk, he would be walking into a federal prison. He looked at the ceiling with empty eyes. He had lost the ability to speak clearly, but his eyes still held a flicker of recognition when he saw me. He tried to turn his head. He tried to summon the old rage. But all he could manage was a guttural sound, a dry croak of frustration. I did not feel pity. I did not feel hate. I looked at him and I saw a ledger that had finally been balanced. I turned around and walked away, leaving him to the mercy of the system he had spent his life cheating. Across town, in a fluorescent-lit discount grocery store, another ghost was haunting the aisles. Vanessa was standing behind register number 4. She wore a blue smock that was 2 sizes too big. Her hair was pulled back in a hairnet. Her manicured nails were gone, replaced by short, unpolished fingertips that were chapped from handling cardboard boxes and counting dirty change. I watched her from the parking lot, sitting in the back of my car. I saw a customer yell at her because a coupon had expired. I saw Vanessa flinch. I saw her swallow her pride, which used to be vast enough to fill a ballroom. She mumbled an apology and kept scanning items. She went home every night to a studio apartment she shared with 2 roommates in a neighborhood she used to make fun of. She was learning the value of $1 the hard way. I signaled my driver to pull away. I had seen enough. The past was buried. It was time to build the future. The elevator to the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue moved with a silent grace that felt like flying. It was Sunday night. The war was over. The lawyers were handling the restructuring of Graves Industries, which was now fully absorbed into Shadow Corp. The lawsuits had been settled. The headlines had faded. Tonight was not about business. It was about family. I walked into the living room. The smell of roasting chicken and rosemary filled the air. Zoe was in the kitchen laughing at something Connor said. They looked happy. They looked light. The shadow of Winston and the toxicity of Vanessa had been lifted from their shoulders. Connor was setting the table. He wore a simple button-down shirt. He looked different than he had a month ago. He stood taller. The bruise on his cheek from Winston's punch had faded, leaving only a small scar, a badge of honor he carried without complaint. I called them into the study. This was the room where we had planned the takedown. This was the room where we had watched the empire fall. But tonight I had covered the wall of monitors. I had cleared the desk of legal briefs and financial reports. In the center of the mahogany table sat a single large tube of rolled paper. Connor and Zoe sat down. They looked at me with curiosity. They knew I had been working on something in secret for the last week. They thought perhaps it was another acquisition or another legal maneuver. I picked up the tube, I uncapped it and slid out the heavy sheets of architectural vellum. I spread them out on the table, weighting down the corners with brass coasters. Connor stood up and leaned over the table. His eyes scanned the lines, the elevations, the structural details. He was an architect. This was his language. He gasped. He recognized the site plan. It was the Hudson Yards project, the flagship development that Winston had tried to gut and sell for parts. But these were not Winston's plans. These were new. They were bold. They incorporated green spaces, community centers, and affordable housing integrated with high-end commercial zones. It was a vision of a city that served everyone, not just the elite. Connor ran his hand over the paper. He looked at the bottom right corner of the sheet where the title block was located. He read the text. Hudson Yards Redevelopment, lead architect and project director Connor O'Malley. He froze. He stared at his name printed in bold black ink. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with shock. He shook his head. He backed away from the table as if the paper were hot to the touch. Luther, he said, his voice shaking. I cannot accept this. This is a $500 million project. This is the biggest development in New York City. I looked at him calmly. I told him that I knew exactly how big it was. I told him that I had reviewed his original sketches, the ones Winston had thrown in the trash. I told him they were brilliant. Connor shook his head again, more frantically this time. It is not about the drawings, Luther. It is about how it looks. People will talk. They will say you gave me this because I am your son-in-law. They will say I am a charity case. They will say I am a gold digger who got lucky. Winston called me useless. If I take this, everyone will think he was right and that I only succeeded because you carried me. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had held Winston back while I took the stage. I want to earn my way, he whispered. I do not want to be another man living off your shadow. I walked around the table. I stood in front of him. I put my hands on his shoulders and forced him to look me in the eye. I saw the pride there, the same pride that had made me refuse to sell my shop for 20 years. It was a good pride, but it was misplaced. Connor, I said, my voice low and steady, you think I am giving you this because you married my daughter. You think I am giving you this because you are family. I pointed at the blueprints. I hired the best engineers in the city to review your work. They told me your designs were superior to anything Winston had proposed. But that is not why I put your name on that block. I took a step closer. I am giving you this because when a madman charged me on a stage in front of 500 people, you did not run. You stepped in front of me. You took a punch that was meant for my face. You bled for me, Connor. You held him back, not with hatred, but with control. I felt my own eyes stinging with tears. I remembered the years of loneliness, the years of wondering if anyone would ever stand by me without a price tag attached. Winston hired Harvard graduates. He hired men with perfect pedigrees and expensive suits, and every single one of them sold him out the moment the ship started to sink. You were fired. You were humiliated. You had every reason to walk away. But you stayed. You fought. I tapped his chest right over his heart. I can hire 1,000 architects, Connor. I can buy talent. But I cannot buy decency. I cannot buy loyalty. I cannot buy the kind of man who treats the janitor with the same respect as the CEO. That is who you are. That is why I trust you with $500 million. Not because you are a good architect, though you are, but because you are a good man. And in my world, a good man is the rarest asset of all. Connor looked at me. The resistance in his face crumbled. He saw that I was not offering him a handout. I was offering him a partnership. He saw that I respected him not for who he married, but for who he was. He took a deep breath. He looked at Zoe, who was smiling through her tears. He looked back at the blueprints. He nodded slowly. "I will not let you down, Luther," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will build something we can both be proud of." I smiled. I knew he would. I pulled him into a hug. It was not a polite handshake. It was an embrace between father and son. Then Zoe cleared her throat. We turned to look at her. She was standing by the window, the city lights framing her silhouette. She was holding a small box in her hands. It was wrapped in silver paper. She had been quiet all evening, watching us, waiting for her moment. "I have a gift too," she said softly. She walked over to me. She handed me the box. It was light. I looked at her. Her eyes were shining with a light I had never seen before. It was not just happiness. It was a deep, profound joy. I untied the ribbon. I tore the paper. Inside was a small white box. I opened it. Resting on a bed of cotton was a simple plastic stick. A pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. I stared at it. The world stopped spinning. The billions of dollars, the skyscrapers, the hostile takeovers, it all vanished. All I saw were those 2 lines. I looked at Zoe. She nodded. "You are going to be a grandfather," she said. I looked at Connor. He was stunned, his mouth open, his eyes moving from Zoe to the box and back again. He let out a laugh, a sound of pure disbelief and wonder. He grabbed Zoe and spun her around, burying his face in her neck. I stood there holding the small plastic stick like it was a diamond. I thought about my father. I thought about the watch I had lost and the legacy I had found. I thought about the baby that was coming. A baby who would never know poverty. A baby who would never know the shame of grease-stained hands. A baby who would grow up in a world we were going to build for them. I felt a tear roll down my cheek. I did not wipe it away. I let it fall. I looked at my family, my real family, the one that money could not buy and the one that no one could ever take away from me. I walked over to them. I wrapped my arms around both of them. We stood there in the penthouse at the top of the world, 3 people who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. The war was over. The work was just beginning. But for the first time in my life, I was not working to survive. I was working to live. And as I looked out at the lights of New York City shining below us, I knew that the shadow had finally found his light. The smell of 90-weight gear oil is a scent that most people scrub off their skin before they sit down to dinner. To me, it smells like truth. It smells like honest work and the simple physics of metal moving against metal. I stood in the center of my old garage in Queens, taking a deep breath of the air that was thick with dust and rust. I had bought the building back 3 days ago. In fact, I had bought the entire city block. The landlord who had evicted me without a second thought when Winston snapped his fingers had trembled when he signed the deed over to Shadow Corp. He thought I was going to tear it down and build a high-rise. He thought I was going to erase the memory of my humiliation. He was wrong. I kept every grease stain on the concrete floor. I kept the old hydraulic lift that groaned when it raised a sedan. I even kept the flickering fluorescent light in the corner office. I did not buy this place to destroy it. I bought it because this was the only church I ever believed in. At 432 Park Avenue, I was a titan of industry who moved billions with a phone call. But here in Queens, I was just Luther, the man who could listen to an engine and tell you exactly which piston was misfiring. I wiped my hands on a shop rag. It was Saturday afternoon. I was working on a 1967 Mustang restoring the carburetor. It was delicate work requiring patience and a steady hand. My phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a message from Connor. He was asking if I was bringing the wine for dinner. Zoe was making a roast. They were waiting for me. I smiled. My life had become a tale of 2 cities. By day, I ruled the skyline. By evening, I retreated to the ground level where the real life happened. I preferred this. I preferred the grime under my fingernails to the manicured handshakes of Wall Street. I preferred the sound of an impact wrench to the polite applause of a gala. Money had bought me security. It had bought me justice. But it could not buy the feeling of fixing something that was broken. That was something you had to earn with your own 2 hands. I heard a sound at the bay door. It was the scuff of a shoe on concrete, a hesitant shuffling sound, not the confident stride of a customer looking for a repair. I turned around. The afternoon sun was streaming in through the open door, creating a silhouette against the bright light of the street. At first, I did not recognize the figure. It was hunched over, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothes despite the mild weather. It looked like one of the many homeless souls who wandered the industrial district looking for cans or a warm place to sleep. I put down my wrench. I walked toward the door, ready to offer a few dollars or a bottle of water. I had never forgotten what it felt like to be discarded, so I never treated the destitute with cruelty. But as I got closer, the figure stepped into the light. I stopped. The breath left my lungs in a sharp exhale. It was Vanessa. But it was not the Vanessa who had stood on the stage at the Plaza Hotel in an emerald gown. It was not the Vanessa who had sneered at my boots. This woman looked 20 years older. Her hair was gray and stringy, hanging limp around a face that was gaunt and hollow. Her skin was papery, etched with deep lines of stress and malnutrition. She was wearing a coat that was too big for her, stained with mud at the hem. Her shoes were cheap sneakers, the kind you buy at a pharmacy, and the laces were knotted. She looked at me. Her eyes were the only thing I recognized. They were still blue, but the spark was gone. The arrogance was gone. There was only a dull, glassy look of survival. She did not sneer. She did not scream. She trembled. She clutched a plastic bag to her chest as if it contained the crown jewels. "Luther," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, like she had not used it in days. I did not speak. I simply watched her. I leaned against the fender of the Mustang, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not feel the surge of anger I expected. I did not feel the desire for revenge. I had already taken my revenge. This was just the aftermath. This was the wreckage left behind after the storm. She took a step closer into the shop. She looked around at the tools, at the oil drums, at the calendar on the wall. She looked at the place she had hated for 15 years. She used to call this place my dungeon. She used to refuse to step inside because she said the smell ruined her hair. Now she looked at it with a hunger I understood all too well. It was warm in here. It was dry. It was safe. "I do not want trouble," she said quickly, holding up a shaking hand. "I know I am not supposed to be here. I know you have a restraining order. I know." "Then why are you here, Vanessa?" I asked. My voice was calm, flat. It was the voice of a mechanic diagnosing a terminal engine failure. She swallowed hard. She looked down at her shoes. "I need help, Luther." She said it so quietly I almost missed it. "I have been living in a shelter in the Bronx. But they kicked me out this morning. I lost my spot. I have nowhere to go tonight. It is going to be cold." She looked up at me and I saw a tear track through the dirt on her cheek. "I just need $100, just enough for a motel room and maybe a hot meal. Please, Luther. I know I was terrible. I know I destroyed us. But we were married. I washed your clothes. I cooked your meals. Doesn't that count for anything? Just one night of mercy." I looked at her. I thought about the $50,000 check she had watched Winston slide across the table. I thought about the bus ticket to Ohio she had thrown in the trash because she thought she deserved half an empire. I thought about the text message she sent me when she sold my father's watch. "Don't bother coming back for your junk." She was right about one thing. She had cooked my meals. She had washed my clothes. For 15 years she had played the role of a wife. She had smiled when I came home. She had kissed me on our anniversary. She had told me she loved me, and every single second of it had been a lie. She had been waiting for something better, waiting for a man like Winston to come along and validate her greed. I did not feel sorry for her. Pity is for victims. Vanessa was not a victim. She was a gambler who had bet everything on zero and lost. I reached into the back pocket of my coveralls. I pulled out my wallet. It was the same leather wallet I had carried for 10 years, worn smooth at the corners. I opened it. I bypassed the black titanium card. I bypassed the platinum business cards. I pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. Vanessa saw the money. Her eyes widened, her hands twitched. She leaned forward, her body betraying her desperation. She looked like an addict seeing a fix. I held the bill out to her. She reached for it, snatching it from my fingers with a speed that was shocking. She clutched it to her chest, checking the corners to make sure it was real. She let out a sob of relief. "Thank you," she wept. "Thank you, Luther. You are a good man." "I always knew you were a good man." She started to back away toward the door, eager to leave, eager to spend the money, eager to escape the shame of my gaze. "Wait," I said. She froze. She looked at me, terrified that I would take the money back. I walked over to her. I stood close enough to smell the street on her clothes. I looked her deep in the eyes. I wanted her to remember this moment for the rest of her life. "That is not charity, Vanessa," I said. "That is a paycheck." She looked confused. "A paycheck?" "Yes," I continued. "You worked for me for 15 years. You pretended to be a wife. You pretended to be a partner. You pretended to care. You put on a performance every single day." I pointed at the bill in her hand. "That is your wage, $100. Because frankly, Vanessa, you were a terrible actress. I saw through you at the end. Winston saw through you. Everyone saw through you. You were never a partner. You were just an employee who tried to rob the company's safe." Her face crumpled. The shame hit her harder than the hunger. She looked at the money, then at me. She wanted to throw it back. She wanted to have pride. But she couldn't. She needed it too much. She clutched the bill tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Get out of my shop," I said softly, "and do not come back. The position has been filled." She turned and ran. She ran out of the bay door into the fading light of the afternoon. She disappeared down the street, a gray ghost vanishing into the city she had tried to conquer. I watched her go until she was just a speck in the distance. I turned back to the Mustang. I picked up my wrench. I tightened the last bolt on the carburetor. It was done. The car was ready. I wiped my hands one last time. I took off my coveralls, hanging them on the hook by the door. I put on my jacket. I walked out of the shop and locked the heavy steel door behind me. I walked to my truck. It was the same Ford F-150. I had never painted over the graffiti. I had scrubbed the red paint, but the faint outline of the word cheater was still visible on the door if you looked closely. I kept it there as a reminder of where I had been and what I had survived. I climbed into the cab. The engine roared to life, a deep rumble that vibrated in my chest. I pulled out onto the street. The sun was setting over the Manhattan skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in one of those towers, my penthouse was waiting. But I wasn't going there. I turned the truck toward upstate New York, toward the house with the big yard where Connor and Zoe were waiting, toward the place where my grandchild would take their first steps. I rolled down the window, letting the cool air hit my face. I thought about Winston rotting in a hospital bed. I thought about Vanessa clutching her $100 in a motel room. They were the past. They were dust in the rearview mirror. I looked at the road ahead. It was wide open. I was Luther King. I was the mechanic. I was the shadow. But most importantly, I was a father, and soon I would be a grandfather. As I drove toward the horizon, the sun dipped below the buildings, casting a long shadow that stretched out ahead of me, covering the city, covering the past, covering everything. It was a big shadow, a powerful shadow. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel dark. It felt like shelter. I turned up the radio. I pressed the gas pedal. And I drove home. This story teaches us a powerful truth. Never judge a man by his hands, for you never know what he has built with them. Vanessa and Winston chased the illusion of wealth, trading 15 years of loyalty for a moment of greed, only to lose everything. They forgot that true power does not need to shout to be heard. It sits quietly in the corner, waiting for the right moment to speak. In the end, integrity is the only currency that never devalues. You can buy a suit, you can buy a house, but you cannot buy the peace of mind that comes from living an honest life. If you believe that loyalty is worth more than gold, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories of justice. Let me know in the comments, would you have given Vanessa that $100? I will see you in the next story.